To hide and then release course content based on completion of an action by a student, you use what's called adaptive release. In this video, I'm going to show you how to hide course content and release it based on student completion of the no-show assignment. In this example, the no-show assignment is in the Start Here content area, which I will access by clicking Start Here in the course menu. The no-show assignment is called no-show test. Generally, instructors want to hide most or all of their course content until students receive a grade for the no-show assignment or simply submit the no-show assignment. To accomplish this task, you must first place an adaptive release on all content you want to hide until specific criteria that you configure is met. In this example, the content I want to hide is in the Lessons content area, which I will access by clicking Lessons in the course menu. I will now place an adaptive release on every folder, learning module, and learning object not inside a folder or learning module that I want to hide. Placing an adaptive release on a folder or learning module hides the folder or learning module and all content within the folder or learning module, and then makes it visible when the criteria you configure is completed by the student. However, if you have learning objects not in folders or modules, like this test and this Dropbox, you must place an adaptive release on each object if you want it hidden until your specified criteria is met. To apply the adaptive release, click the arrow to the right of the folder, module, or object and choose Adaptive Release. In this example, I will begin by clicking the arrow next to the Week 1 folder and selecting Adaptive Release. On the Adaptive Release screen, select the criteria that will release this folder, meaning make the folder visible to students. You have 4 criteria from which to choose: date, membership, grade, and review status. In this video, I will discuss only the grade criteria, which releases content based on student submission of or grade on a specific assignment. To hide content until an assignment is submitted or graded, you configure the grade criteria field. In this example, I want to hide the Week 1 folder and release it when the student submits the no-show test. First, from the drop-down menu to the right of Select a Grade Center column, select the assignment that will release this content. In this case, that assignment is the no-show test. In other words, I am telling Blackboard to hide the Week 1 folder and then release it based on criteria I will configure for the no-show test. If you want the content released as soon as the student submits the no-show test, leave the default "User has at least one attempt for this item" selected. However, if you want the content released based on a grade for the no-show test, you would choose one of the 2 remaining options under the default, both of which allow you to select score or percent, and then choose the grade or grade range that will release the content. In this example, I want to release the content as soon as the student submits the no-show test. I therefore will leave the default "User has at least one attempt for this item" selected, which will make the Week 1 folder visible as soon as the student submits the test, regardless of the grade the test earns. Scroll up or down and click Submit, which returns you to the content area of the object on which you just applied the adaptive release, in this case, the Lessons area. The Week 1 folder now displays Enabled Adaptive Release underneath it. You must configure an adaptive release for each folder, learning module, and independent learning object that you want to hide and release based on specific criteria. Next, let's hide the Week 2 learning module in the Lessons content area by clicking the arrow to the right of the module and choosing Adaptive Release. I'll scroll to the Grade criteria field, click the arrow to the right of Select a Grade Center column, and choose the assignment that will hide and release this module, in this case, the no-show test. Next to Select Condition, I will leave the default User has at least one attempt for this item selected, which will release the Week 2 Learning module when the student submits this no-show test. Last, I'll click Submit, which returns me to the Lessons Content area where the Week 2 Learning module now displays Enabled Adaptive Release underneath it. I will continue placing identical adaptive releases on the rest of the content in the Lessons area. In this example, the only other content is the Unit 1 test and the poetry paper Dropbox. Everything in the Lessons content area now has an adaptive release on it and is now invisible to students until they satisfy the criteria configured for the adaptive releases, which is submitting the no-show test. To check an adaptive release to make sure it's set up correctly or to edit the adaptive release, click the arrow to the right of the content item, in this case the Week 1 folder, and choose Adaptive Release Advanced. On the Adaptive Release Advanced screen, the adaptive release displays under Rule Name. By default, the adaptive release name is always Rule 1. Click the arrow to the right of Rule 1 and choose Edit Criteria. On the Manage Criteria Rule 1 screen, click the arrow to the right of the criteria type, in this case, the arrow to the right of Grade, and choose Edit. On the next screen, you can view and edit the criteria. You cannot change the criteria on this screen, only edit the existing criteria. After editing the criteria, click Submit, or if you are satisfied with the criteria, click Cancel, which is what I will do. Click OK on the bottom right corner of the next two screens, which returns you to the content item. Let's return to Lessons by clicking the Lessons menu item. To change the criteria of an adaptive release to another of the 4 kinds of criteria, you must delete the existing adaptive release and configure a new one. You do this by clicking the arrow to the right of the content item, in this case the Week 1 folder, and selecting Adaptive Release Advanced. Place a check mark to the left of Rule 1. Click the Delete button above or below Rule 1, and then click OK in the bottom right corner of the screen. This action will remove the adaptive release. In this example, I do not want to remove the adaptive release, so I will cancel this action by clicking Lessons in the course menu to return to the Lessons content area. Now let's look at how adaptive release works for students. If the adaptive releases I've just placed on the content in Lessons work correctly, students will not be able to see any content in Lessons until they submit the no-show test. Let's enter Student Preview mode by clicking the Student Preview icon on the top right corner of the screen, where we can make sure these adaptive releases work the way we want them to. As the Student Preview user, let's click Lessons, and the Student Preview user is unable to see any content. As the Student Preview user, let's go to the Start Here content area by clicking its link in the course menu. Let's take the no-show test by clicking the test link and then clicking Begin. After answering the one question on this test, we'll click Save and Submit and then OK on the pop-up menu, and exit the test by clicking OK on the bottom right corner of the next two screens, which returns the Student Preview user to the test. Now that the Student Preview user has submitted this test, let's click Lessons. The Student Preview user can now see all content because the Student Preview user submitted the no-show test. As an instructor, you have verified that the adaptive release on the Week 1 folder is working correctly. In your teaching courses, You should test all of your adaptive releases in student preview mode to make sure they all work.